Hey everyone, and welcome back to your daily digest of the top stories from Hacker News. Yesterday was quite a day. We reviewed 30 stories that hit the front page, and I've picked the 5 that really got the community fired up. We're talking hundreds of points and thousands of comments across these stories. Today, we've got a fascinating mix, from underground digital libraries preserving human knowledge to developers literally building apps to fight back against big tech's attention-grabbing features. We'll explore a radical rethinking of web development that fits everything in a single HTML file, dive into Obsidian's controversial new database feature, and cap it off with NASA somehow managing to bungle the release of an incredible space photo. These stories really capture the current tensions in tech, the fight for open access to information, the battle for our attention, and the eternal struggle between simplicity and complexity in software design. So let's dive in with our top story, which pulled in almost 800 points and sparked one of the most passionate debates we've seen in a while. All right, now we're diving into something that's generating a lot of passionate debate. Anna's Archive, an update from the team. This one really struck a nerve with the Hacker News crowd, pulling in almost 800 points and over 400 comments, and honestly, I can see why. So, Anna's Archive calls itself the largest truly open library in human history, which is quite a claim, right? But when you dig into what they've been doing since 2022, it's actually kind of staggering. They've essentially been on this massive preservation crusade, scraping and archiving tens of millions of books, scientific articles, magazines, newspapers, basically anything they can get their digital hands on. And we're not talking about random blog posts here. They've gone after the big institutional collections like Internet Archive's Controlled Digital Lending Program, HathiTrust, and DUCU. What's really fascinating is how they're approaching this whole thing. They've scraped it with they're calling the largest book metadata collections in history, think WorldCat and Google Books, not necessarily to grab the books themselves, but to figure out what rare materials are still out there that need preserving. It's like they're creating this massive map of human knowledge and then systematically filling in the gaps.
The preservation method itself is pretty clever too. They're using distributed torrenting, which means these materials aren't sitting in one vulnerable server somewhere. They're spread across thousands of computers worldwide, which, when you think about it, protects them from all sorts of threats they mention: natural disasters, wars, budget cuts, even just institutional neglect. It's basically crowdsourced preservation. But here's where it gets spicy. The team put out this warning about a new player called WeLib that's apparently taking from the ecosystem without contributing back. And this reveals something really interesting about the shadow library world. There's actually this code of honor among these technically illegal operations. Like, yeah, we're all pirates here, but we're principled pirates who share the loot. The community reaction on Hacker News is overwhelmingly positive, which might surprise some people. User after user is sharing stories about how these shadow libraries actually help them discover and evaluate content before buying physical copies. One person described it perfectly. They use Anna's Archive like a preview service, finding books they love and then hunting down physical editions to add to their collection. It's almost like the piracy leads to purchases argument we used to hear about music, except people are providing actual examples. There was this one composer in the comments, though, who pushed back pretty hard, arguing that free access to creative works is starving these industries. They pointed to the music industry's decline since the 90s and how difficult it's become for creators to make a living. And look, that's a real concern we can't just dismiss. The tension between preservation, access, and creator compensation is genuinely complex. What really caught my attention was the discussion about attacks on their infrastructure. Anna's Archive isn't just dealing with legal challenges. They're facing active attempts to take them down. Multiple libgen forks have disappeared recently, and the team's clearly feeling the pressure. Yet they're still out here publicly updating everyone on their progress, almost daring authorities to come after them. The technical scale of what they're doing is mind-blowing too. We're talking about organizing and making searchable billions of pieces of content, creating systems that can handle massive distributed downloads, maintaining redundancy across a hostile internet. It's genuinely impressive engineering work, regardless of how you feel about the ethics.
And that ethical dimension is where things get really interesting.
The hacker news community seems to view this less as piracy and more as a vital public service, preserving humanity's literary heritage from corporate control, paywalls, and potential destruction. One commenter made this point that really stuck with me. In an age where we're seeing books banned, libraries defunded, and academic publishers charging astronomical fees for publicly funded research, maybe these shadow libraries are performing an essential function that our official institutions are failing at. The whole WeLib situation adds another layer to this. Here's Anna's archive, operating in legally great territory, calling out another shadow library for not playing fair. It's like, even in the underground, there are rules and expectations about contributing to the common good. The fact that they're publicly shaming WeLab for being selfish tells you something about the values driving this community. What we're really looking at here is a parallel infrastructure for human knowledge, one that exists because the official systems have become so broken, so expensive, so restrictive, that a critical mass of people decided to just build their own. And now it's reached a scale where it might actually be too big to stop, with materials distributed across so many torrents and mirrors that taking it down would be like trying to uninvent the internet itself. Speaking of people building their own solutions to broken systems, our next story is about developers taking matters into their own hands in a different way, this time fighting back against the very platforms they use every day. So now let's dive into something that really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. Show HN, I built an app to block shorts and reels. And wow, with 550 points and over 200 comments, this clearly hit a nerve. So here's the deal. Someone built Scroll Guard, an app that basically acts as a bouncer for your phone, keeping those addictive short-form videos out. We're talking Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, Facebook's version, even Reddit's video player, all blocked. The developers basically declaring war on doom scrolling, and honestly, the community is here for it.
What's fascinating is this isn't just another digital wellness app that gently suggests you take a break. No, this thing straight up blocks the content. On Android, it's fully functional right now, and they've got this clever anti-scroll mode that can limit scrolling on any app, not just social media. Though here's where it gets interesting. iOS users are going to have to wait because Apple's walled garden makes it technically impossible to implement the same blocking mechanism. The developers having to completely rethink their approach for iOS, which really makes you wonder, is Apple protecting users from potentially harmful apps, or are they protecting their advertising partners' engagement metrics? The discussion thread is where things get really juicy. People are absolutely fed up with how these platforms operate. One user described how Instagram only lets you snooze recommendations for 30 days max before they come flooding back. 30 days? That's not a feature, that's a countdown timer to your next doom scrolling session. Another person pointed out how YouTube will literally ignore your not interested feedback and keep serving you the same content anyway. But here's what really caught my attention: the permission requirements on Android. To make this work, ScrollGuard needs extensive accessibility permissions, which, yeah, that's a lot of trust to hand over to an app. Some users are understandably sketched out about this. It's like you're trying to protect your attention, but you might be trading away your privacy in the process. Classic tech dilemma right there. The community's sharing all sorts of alternative solutions too. Some folks are using uBlock Original with custom filters. Others have discovered apps like DF Instagram that strip out the addictive features while keeping the core functionality. One person even suggested just abandoning ship entirely and moving to decentralized platforms like PixelFed. That's pretty extreme, but I get it. Sometimes the only winning move is not to play. What's really telling is that we're now in this bizarre arms race where third-party developers are building apps specifically to undo features that billion-dollar companies spent millions developing. Think about that for a second. Instagram's engineers are working overtime to make Reels more engaging, more sticky, more impossible to resist, and here comes ScrollGuard saying, nope, not on my watch. One commenter made a really good point, though. They said blocking all Reels on Instagram is problematic because sometimes those are actual videos from friends they want to see. The real enemy isn't the format itself, it's the infinite scroll, the algorithmic feeding tube of content designed to keep you hooked. It's not about the individual videos, it's about the delivery mechanism that turns them into digital crack. This whole situation really highlights how we've reached this breaking point where users are actively fighting back against the very features these platforms tout as innovations. Remember when infinite scroll was considered a UX breakthrough? Now we're downloading apps to break it. When autoplay was the future of video consumption, now we're installing extensions to stop it. The fact that this got so much traction on Hacker News tells you everything. These aren't technophobes or Luddites. This is a community of people who build software for a living, and even they're saying enough is enough when it comes to these attention-hijacking features. It's like we've built these incredible tools, but somewhere along the way, they stopped serving us and started farming us for engagement metrics. And speaking of developers trying to radically simplify the tools we use, our next story takes that idea to an absolute extreme. All right, so our next story is about something called Hyperclay, which promises to let you build web apps in a single, portable, self-updating vanilla HTML file. And wow, this one really got people talking. 605 points and over 200 comments on Hacker News, with some pretty heated debates about whether this is genius or madness. So here's the wild idea. Imagine if your entire web app, the interface, the logic, all the data, lived in just one HTML file. Not only that, but this file can actually modify and save itself. No build steps, no deployment pipelines, no separate database. Just one file that contains everything and rewrites itself as users interact with it. The creators are calling it Hyperclay, and they're positioning it as this radical simplification of web development. The way they describe it is pretty poetic, actually. Instead of managing infrastructure and juggling frameworks, you're basically sculpting clay. You can edit the app while it's running, see changes instantly without refreshing, and there's no compilation step. It's like, imagine if building a web app was as immediate as editing a Google Doc. You make a change, it's there, it's saved, done.
Now, what's really interesting is that this goes against basically everything we've been taught about good software architecture for the past few decades, right? Separation of concerns? Gone. The whole model view controller pattern? Out the window. Instead, everything is mushed together in this single file that is simultaneously the source code, the running application, and the data store. It's almost rebellious in how much it throws away conventional wisdom. The discussion thread is fascinating because you can see people's brains kind of breaking a little bit trying to understand this. One commenter, Nishajmi, makes a really good point. They're saying, wait a minute, you still need a server to actually persist these changes, so how is this really different from having a backend? And they're not wrong. Hyperclay does need something to save the modified HTML file back to disk, so you haven't completely eliminated the server component, you've just changed what it does. What's also interesting is how many people are pointing out this isn't exactly a new idea. TiddlyWiki has been doing something similar for over 20 years. It's a personal wiki that lives in a single HTML file and can save itself. There were Windows HTA files back in the day, something called web straits. One commenter even points out that Tim Berners-Lee's original vision for the web included pages that could be edited directly in the browser. So in a way, Hyperclay is reaching back to these older ideas, but trying to modernize them. The technical concerns people are raising are pretty valid too, like what happens when multiple users are editing the same app? How do you handle conflicts? One user, Melito, brings up this great point about efficiency. If every tiny user edit means saving the entire HTML document with all its verbosity, that's potentially a lot of unnecessary data being stored and transmitted. And then there's the version divergence problem. If users can modify their own copies of the app and developers release updates, how do you reconcile those different versions? But here's what I find compelling about this whole thing. Even if Hyperclay itself doesn't become the next big thing, it's asking a really important question. Have we overcomplicated web development? I mean, think about the modern web stack. You've got your front-end framework, your build tools, your bundler, your package manager, your back-end API, your database, your deployment pipeline, your CDN. It's a lot. And for many simple applications, it might be overkill.
The website itself is, well, it's trying to be artistic and storytelling focused, which some commenters found more confusing than helpful. They're going for this whole narrative about the history of computing and creativity, but apparently it obscures the actual technical details of how hyperclay works. Sometimes being too clever with your presentation can backfire, and it seems like that might be happening here. Despite all the skepticism, though, there's something undeniably appealing about the core promise, the idea that you could just have an app that's a file, email it to someone, put it on a USB stick, host it anywhere or nowhere, no dependencies, no npm install, no Docker containers, just double-click and it works. Forever. That's powerful simplicity, even if the implementation details are still fuzzy. I think what we're seeing here is part of a broader pendulum swing in web development. We went so far toward complexity and sophistication that now there's this hunger for simplicity again. Whether hyperclay is the answer or just another experiment along the way, well, that remains to be seen. But 605 points and 214 comments tells me a lot of developers are at least intrigued by the possibility of doing things differently. Now, if hyperclay represents one extreme of simplification, our next story shows what happens when a beloved simple tool tries to add complexity. So here's something interesting that's got the Obsidian community pretty fired up. Let's dive into Obsidian Bases, which is causing quite the stir on Hacker News with over 460 points and a really spirited discussion happening in the comments. Now, if you're not familiar with Obsidian, it's this incredibly powerful note-taking app that's built around the idea of connecting your thoughts and creating a second brain. And they've just made public this feature called Bases, which is essentially their take on bringing database functionality right into your notes. Think of it like, you know how in Notion you can create these database views and filter your content? Well, Obsidian's trying to do something similar, but with their own spin on it. What's fascinating about the community reaction here is that it's really split. On one hand, you've got folks who've been using this plugin called DataView, which has been the go-to solution for database-like queries in Obsidian for years now, and they're looking at Bases as potentially the official replacement. The big deal here is that Bases would be first-class support, meaning it's built right into the core app, rather than being a third-party add-on that could break with updates.
But here's where it gets interesting. The implementation is apparently pretty rough right now. One user, Galaxcoby, is absolutely tearing into it, saying it's poorly implemented and missing really basic functionality. They're talking about things like not being able to select multiple cells at once, having these arbitrary row limits, and just general usability issues that make it frustrating to actually use in practice. And they're not alone. There's this recurring theme in the comments about the documentation being pretty weak, which is not great for a feature that's supposed to make complex data management easier. But what really caught my eye, though, is how people are talking about using this for personal CRM functionality. Several users are describing how they want to track their interactions with people, maintain conversation histories, keep notes on relationships. It's this really human use case for what sounds like a pretty technical feature. One person's talking about how they use it to remember details about their friends and colleagues, when they last spoke, what they talked about. It's kind of beautiful, actually, using this database technology to be a better friend. But then you've got this architectural debate happening too. There's a user called Blubber who's really uncomfortable with how Obsidian handles databases, this one file, one record approach where each database entry is actually a separate markdown file. And I get their concern. It does feel a bit clunky when you're used to traditional databases where everything is in nice, efficient tables. But that's also kind of the Obsidian philosophy, right? Everything is a note, everything is interconnected, everything is human-readable markdown that you actually own. The tension here seems to be between Obsidian's core philosophy of simplicity and ownership versus the community's desire for more powerful features. Some users are saying Obsidian's becoming too complex, that it's got this steep learning curve that's putting people off. Others are frustrated that Bases doesn't go far enough, that it's missing features they need for serious data management.
And you know what's really telling? The help page for Bases, the actual URL from the Hacker News post, is apparently not even accessible right now. That's not a great look when you're trying to launch a major new feature. It speaks to maybe a premature release or at least some coordination issues on their end. What I think we're seeing here is the classic challenge of a tool trying to evolve beyond its original purpose. Obsidian started as this elegant markdown editor for connected notes, and now it's trying to be a full knowledge management system with database capabilities. And that transition, it's messy. The community that fell in love with the simplicity is watching it grow more complex, while the power users who want these features are finding the implementation lacking. The real question is whether Obsidian can pull off this balancing act, keeping the simplicity and philosophy that made it popular while adding the advanced features that users are clearly craving. Based on this discussion, they've got some work to do on Bases before it's ready to replace something like DataView for serious users. And speaking of organizations struggling with their public releases, our final story today shows that even NASA, yes, NASA, can fumble something as simple as sharing a photo. All right, so switching gears a bit here, let's talk about a gigantic jet caught on camera, a spectacular moment for NASA astronaut. And yes, that's spectacular with an I. NASA's getting punny with their headlines these days. So here's what happened. NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers managed to capture something pretty extraordinary from the International Space Station, a gigantic jet. Now, before you start picturing a massive Boeing 747 or something, we're talking about an atmospheric electrical phenomenon here. These things are basically nature's own light show, massive electrical discharges that shoot upward from thunderstorm clouds into the upper atmosphere. Think of it like lightning's weird cousin that decided to go the wrong direction. But here's where the Hacker News community got, let's say, a little frustrated. NASA releases this announcement about capturing this incredible, rare phenomenon, and what do they give us? A tiny 512 by 218 pixel image. I mean, come on, we're talking about NASA here, the same organization that sends us mind-blowing images from the James Webb Telescope, and they're giving us what essentially amounts to a thumbnail of one of the coolest atmospheric events you can witness from space? The comments section was absolutely roasting them for this. One user pointed out that you can actually find better resolution versions on Wikimedia Commons and the astronaut's own Twitter account, which honestly makes it even more baffling why NASA's official release used such a potato-quality image. It's like they're deliberately trolling us at this point. But beyond the image quality drama, there's actually a fascinating discussion that emerged about the history of these phenomena. For decades, airline pilots would report seeing these bizarre upward lightning strikes and other strange atmospheric lights, and the scientific community basically said, yeah, sure, buddy, maybe lay off the coffee. Same thing happened with sailors reporting rogue waves. Scientists dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or hallucinations until we finally got photographic evidence and proper measurements. It's this classic pattern in science where observational reports from credible witnesses get dismissed until there's official documentation. Sprites, elves, blue jets, gigantic jets, all these atmospheric phenomena have these whimsical names now, but they were essentially scientific folklore until the 1990s, when we finally started capturing them on camera. And even then, it took high-speed cameras and specific conditions to really study them properly. What's really cool about gigantic jets specifically is how rare they are. We're talking about electrical discharges that can reach 50 to 90 kilometers up into the atmosphere. That's hitting the edge of space. They form this connection between the thundercloud and the ionosphere, creating what's essentially a massive electrical circuit in the sky. The physics behind it is still not completely understood, which makes every observation from the ISS incredibly valuable for research. The irony here is that we finally have an astronaut in the perfect position to capture these events with presumably some pretty decent camera equipment on the ISS, and NASA decides to share it with the world in a resolution that would have been embarrassing in 2005. Several commenters were practically begging for the raw images, and honestly, can you blame them? This is the kind of thing that makes you wonder about NASA's media strategy sometimes. There's also this interesting side conversation about how the terminology confused people initially. Gigantic jet does sound like it could be about aircraft, doesn't it? But once people figured out what we were actually talking about, the discussion got really technical about transient luminous events and upper atmospheric lightning. It's one of those topics where the hacker news crowd really shines. You've got people sharing research papers, explaining the electromagnetic physics, and connecting it to broader atmospheric science.
The whole thing really highlights this tension between NASA's incredible scientific achievements and their sometimes baffling public communication choices. Here you have this perfect intersection of accessible science, a spectacular visual phenomenon that anyone can appreciate, and they fumble the presentation with an image that looks like it was compressed for dial-up internet. It's honestly kind of endearing in a weird way, like NASA's reminding us they're still a government agency at heart,